Text arrived at 6:37 on a Friday morning. I know the exact time because my phone lit up the hotel room ceiling and I had not slept. 4 words from my mother. "We're so proud of Marcus." No period. Just that, floating in the dark above me, while I lay in a king bed in the Sheraton in downtown Seattle, still in the blazer I had worn to my own promotion ceremony 4 hours earlier. Too tired and too hollow to change. Let me back up. I had been at Farlow Systems for 6 years. I was 29 years old, and I was the youngest lead compliance analyst the firm had ever promoted to senior level. The kind of thing that gets announced at the quarterly all-staff with a small round of applause and a handshake from the regional director and a glass of lukewarm champagne in a conference room on the 14th floor. It is not a parade. It is not a Tariel hooding ceremony in a rented auditorium. But it was mine, and I had worked for it in the particular grinding way that people work when they understand very clearly that no one is going to hand them anything. My parents live in Columbus, Ohio. The flight to Seattle is 4 hours and 40 minutes. I had checked. My brother Marcus lives in Austin. The flight from Columbus to Austin is 2 hours and 20 minutes. That same weekend, Marcus was hosting what he called an investor showcase for his startup, a logistics software company he had been building for 3 years on a combination of venture optimism, our father's retirement savings, and our mother's absolute certainty that he was going to change the way America moved packages from warehouses to front doors. The showcase was on Saturday. My promotion ceremony was on Friday evening. It is possible to attend both. I had not said that directly. I had sent the calendar invitation 6 weeks in advance. I had followed up with a phone call. My mother had said, "Honey, you know how Marcus gets before these things. He really needs us in the room. You understand. You've always been the steady one." That sentence, "You've always been the steady one." I had been hearing it in various forms for most of my life. What it meant, translated from parent into plain language, was this: you do not require management. You will be fine. And because you will be fine, we are going to direct our attention and our energy and our presence toward the one who will not. I grew up in a house where my brother's potential was a weather system that organized everything around it. I do not think my parents were cruel. I want to say that clearly, because the cruel version is simpler and also wrong. They were people who had somehow decided, early on and without ever saying it out loud, that Marcus was the one who needed the amplifying and I was the one who needed the steadying. His C- in algebra was a learning difference worth addressing. My B+ in the same class was followed by a brief discussion of whether I was spending too much time on extracurriculars. His entry-level sales job at 22 was cause for a dinner at the good Italian place on Henderson Road. My scholarship to Ohio State was met with genuine warmth, and also, from my father, a mild observation that engineering was a very competitive field for women. By the time I was standing in that conference room in Seattle at 29, accepting a handshake and a title I had built from scratch, I had a long and quiet history of recalibrating my own expectations downward so the gap between what I hoped for and what arrived would not be wide enough to fall through. My manager, a compact woman named Denise who had recruited me out of a mid-tier firm 4 years earlier and had the particular intensity of someone who had spent 20 years being underestimated in technical spaces, noticed me checking my phone during the champagne portion of the evening. "Family?" she said. "They couldn't make it." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I recognized as someone doing the math on something without asking for the full equation. Then she refilled my glass and said, "For what it's worth, I have watched a lot of analysts come through this firm. You see patterns other people miss and you document them so cleanly that they become impossible to argue with. That is a rare thing. The people in this room know it." I thought about that sentence for a long time on the drive back to the hotel. I thought about it lying on top of the hotel comforter in my blazer, and then my mother's text arrived, 4 words about my brother, and I'd put my phone face down on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling until it was light enough outside to justify getting up. I ordered room service coffee and sat at the small desk by the window watching the ferry cross Elliott Bay in the gray morning. And I thought about what it means to spend years being the person who is fine. You develop a particular competence at being fine. You learn to locate the satisfaction in your own work, to find the celebration in a clean report and a solved problem, and the specific pleasure of a system that functions correctly because you understood it well enough to fix it. You get good at not needing the audience. And then one day you realize that getting good at not needing something is not the same thing as not wanting it. I finished the coffee. I checked out of the hotel. I drove to my apartment in Fremont, a 2-bedroom I had been renting for 3 years with a view of the ship canal that I still found unreasonably beautiful on clear mornings. I changed my clothes. I sat at my kitchen table and I wrote a short, honest email to my parents. I said the promotion had gone well. I said I wished they had been there. I said I thought we needed to have some real conversations about how our family allocated attention, and that I was open to those conversations when they were ready. I said I was not angry, which was mostly true. I said I was tired, which was entirely true. My father responded that evening. He said I was being sensitive. He said Marcus needed this more than I did. He said I had always had everything figured out and it was hard to explain that to someone like me. My mother's response came 2 days later. She said she hoped the ceremony had been nice. She said Marcus's showcase had gone beautifully. She said she had sent a gift card to my Amazon wish list. My brother did not respond. I put my phone in a drawer and went for a run along the canal path until my lungs hurt enough that the other things stopped hurting quite as much. That was in March. What happened in October is the part that is harder to explain, not because it is complicated, but because the truth of it requires me to be precise about something that is easy to collapse into a simpler story. So, I am going to be precise. Farlow's Systems had been retained by a private equity group called Carver Holdings to conduct cybersecurity and data compliance audits on a portfolio of 8 mid-size companies they were in the process of acquiring. My team was assigned 3 of the 8. The work was standard. We were looking for regulatory exposure, data handling vulnerabilities, liability gaps that might affect the acquisition terms. The kind of audit that surfaces quietly and becomes very loud only if someone has something to hide. I was assigned the intake files on a Tuesday morning. I went through the first 2 companies without incident. The third file I opened, I sat with for a long time before I said anything to anyone. The company was called Ashworth Digital Logistics. My brother's company. His middle name is James. Our last name is Ashworth. He had named it after himself, which was the kind of thing that had seemed charming when my mother mentioned it and felt like something else entirely when I was looking at it in a compliance intake form at 9 in the morning. I closed the file. I reopened it. I read the company description, the founding date, the registered address in Austin, the name of the CEO. I thought about the investor showcase in March. I thought about the forward text. And then I did what the job requires, which was to disclose the conflict of interest immediately and completely. My conversation with Denise took 11 minutes. She asked 4 clarifying questions. She said I was recused from the recommendation section and from any direct communication with the client. She said everything I had already processed on the other 2 files was clean and unaffected. She said, and I want to get this right because it mattered to me. She said, I would have been surprised if you had handled this any other way. The audit of Ashworth's Digital Logistics was assigned to 2 of my colleagues. I was not in the room for their findings. I learned what they found, the same way I would have learned it for any company in which I had no personal stake, through the summary documentation that circulated at the team level. What they found was not catastrophic in the way that makes headlines. It was the kind of problem that is worse in some ways, because it is structural and quiet and has been accumulating undisturbed. My brother's company had expanded its client base over the previous 18 months to include 3 regional healthcare supply chain operators. That expansion had not been accompanied by the corresponding upgrade in data handling protocols. Customer information, including what the regulations classify as sensitive business data with HIPAA-adjacent implications for the healthcare clients, was being stored in a system that had not been updated to meet current CCPA standards. There were 2 instances in the prior 12 months where the company's internal flagging process had identified potential exposure and the response had been inadequate and undocumented. The audit trail was thin in exactly the places it needed to be thick. My colleague's report was precise. The liability exposure was significant enough that Carver Holdings would need to include a corrective action requirement in the acquisition terms, which would affect the valuation. I sat with the information for one evening before I did anything with it. I want to be honest about that evening because I think the honest version is more useful than the clean version. I did not feel righteous. I did not feel vindicated. I sat in my kitchen with a glass of wine I did not finish, and I thought about my brother at 26, excited about something for the first time in his life, and my parents at the investor showcase in Austin, and the forward text at 6:47 in the morning. And I thought about the healthcare supply chain clients and the data sitting in an unencrypted format and the gap between what the system said was being done and what was actually being done and what was actually being done. Then I called my brother. He answered on the third ring, which told me he had looked at the screen and decided to pick up rather than deciding to ignore it. There was a significance to that. I chose not to analyze too closely. I told him what I could tell him within the bounds of my professional obligations, which was not everything, but was enough. I told him an audit had identified compliance gaps. I told him the gaps were remediable but required immediate and documented action. I told him that proactive self-correction before the acquisition finalized would be received very differently than discovered non-compliance after the fact. I told him he needed to talk to an attorney by Monday. There was a long silence. Not the silence of someone processing new information. The silence of someone locating the version of this conversation that makes them the injured party. "You're doing this because Mom and Dad didn't come to Seattle," he said. "I am doing this," I said, "because I have a professional obligation to tell you what I know, and because some of your clients' data is not protected the way you told them it was protected. This is about the ceremony. You've always needed everything to be about you." I stayed very still on my end of the line. I thought about the years of B+s that weren't triumphs. I thought about the scholarship announcement that turned into a conversation about extracurriculars. I thought about the hotel room ceiling and the ferry crossing the bay in the gray morning. "This is about data security," I said. "That's it. I hope you call an attorney." He hung up. My parents called the next morning. My father first, then my mother on the same call, the way they do when they have coordinated. My father said I had gone out of my way to sabotage something Marcus had worked for. My mother said I needed to understand what this kind of thing did to a family. She said Marcus was devastated. She said she did not understand why I always had to make things harder than they needed to be. I want to tell you that I had a perfect response. Something measured and devastating and final. I did not. I said, I disclosed a conflict of interest and my colleagues conducted an independent audit. I said, the findings are what they are, regardless of what happened in March. I said, I told Marcus before the report was finalized because I wanted him to have time to address it. I said, I'm sorry this is hard. My father said the words "you always," and I stopped processing the sentence after that. My mother said she thought I had more loyalty to this family than this. I said I had a great deal of loyalty to this family, and that loyalty was not the same thing as silence. My father hung up. My mother stayed on the line for a few more seconds and then said very quietly that she hoped I knew what I was doing. And then she hung up too. I contacted the attorney I had been referred to by Farlow's legal department for the conflict of interest documentation process. I spent the following week making sure every step of my disclosure was clean and time-stamped and bulletproof. Not because I was afraid, because neatness is a form of protection, and I had learned a long time ago that the people who keep the tidiest paper trail are the people who can afford to sleep. The acquisition process moved forward. Carver Holdings accepted the corrective action requirement as a condition of the deal, which reduced the valuation by an amount my brother later described to my mother as ruinous. Though the acquisition still closed and the company still exists and the client's data is now, by all accounts, properly secured, the attorney I had consulted confirmed that my documentation was thorough enough that my professional role in the outcome was not ambiguous to anyone who looked at it clearly. I did not feel triumphant about any of this. I want to say that again because the triumphant version of the story keeps trying to write itself, and it is not what happened. What I felt was a specific, heavy relief. The kind that comes from having done the thing that needed to be done in the correct way, and then having to live with the consequences of correctness, which are not always comfortable. My mother sent an email in December. She had typed it carefully, the kind of email where you can sense the multiple drafts behind it. She wrote about the year. She wrote about how things had been difficult since the acquisition situation. She wrote about my father, who had been upset in the way that he gets upset, quietly and for a long time. Near the end of the email, in a paragraph that was shorter than the others, she wrote, "I've been thinking about Seattle. I think we may have let you down. I'm not sure we understood what that night meant to you." I read that paragraph many times. I noticed what it was and what it was not. It was an acknowledgement. It was not an apology. It was the closest she had come to honest in a long time, and it had arrived only after the year had been expensive enough to make honesty feel necessary. I wrote back. I said I was glad she had written. I said I had been thinking too. I said I was open to real conversations, not the kind where we talk around the shape of things, but the actual conversations, the ones where we say what we mean. I said I loved her. I signed it with my full name, first and last. She replied 3 days later. She said she would like that. She said she didn't always know how. I thought that was the most honest thing she had said to me in years. My brother and I have not spoken since October. I do not know yet what that silence is. Whether it is permanent or provisional. Whether it is grief or just distance that hasn't decided what it is yet. I leave the door open in my mind without standing in front of it waiting. That is the best I can do right now. My relationship with my father is formal in the way that relationships become when two people are being careful with each other. We talk on holidays. He asks about work in the way that people ask about things they have decided not to fully understand. I answer in the way that people answer when they have decided not to need the understanding. Denise promoted me again in January. Lead of the compliance division, 5 direct reports, the kind of title that means I am now the person who looks at other people the way she once looked at me and says, "You see patterns other people miss." The work is the same work I have always done, which is to look at a system and find the place where the structure creates the gap and document it so clearly that the gap cannot be argued away. I am good at it. I have always been good at it. I tend a small garden on my apartment balcony now. 2 raised beds, tomatoes that produce more than I can eat. Herbs I give to the neighbor downstairs who cooks in ways that make the whole hallway smell like somewhere else. I am not a natural gardener. I am learning it the same way I have learned most things, which is by paying attention to what is actually happening rather than what I assumed would happen. The mornings are quiet in the way that mornings become when you have stopped spending them waiting for something. I make coffee and watch the light come off the water, and I think about the woman in the Sheraton elevator at 6 in the morning, the one who had looked at me checking my phone and said something true without making it a large occasion. I think about Denise at the champagne reception, who saw what I was without asking me to explain it. I think about the email my mother typed carefully in December, the paragraph that was shorter than the others. Some people, I have learned, only understand the value of what you do when the absence of it costs them something. That is not a tragedy. It is information. And information, in the right hands, is not a weapon. It is just clarity. Here's what I know now that I did not know at 29. Lying in a hotel room in a blazer in the dark, reading a 4-word text on the ceiling. Being the steady one is not the same thing as being the unimportant one. Being the one who is fine is not the same thing as being the one who doesn't need anything. And the moment you stop quietly lowering your own expectations to close the gap, that moment is not a betrayal. It is just the beginning of a more accurate map. So I'll leave you with this. When the people in your life have spent years counting on you to be fine, to not require the front row, to let your milestones be smaller than theirs without protest. At what point does their comfort with your silence become something you can no longer afford to provide? And when you finally stop providing it, what do you think you will do with all the room that opens up?